So, Michael, it's hard to tell from the outside. We've been told before that we're close to a deal. How difficult would it be to get a deal done at this point in NAFTA?
Well, I think a deal is doable. It depends, of course, whether there's flexibility and creativity on both sides. About 90% of what they're negotiating in this new NAFTA is the former Trans-Pacific Partnership text. So this is text that Mexico and Canada have already agreed to. It forms a good foundation for going forward. It's the last 10%, of course, that's the most difficult. And issues like making the agreement go away after 5 years, sunset after 5 years, unless all three countries act affirmatively, creates a lot of uncertainty. Part of that uncertainty is what the administration wants. It wants to create more uncertainty about investing in Mexico so that more people will invest in the United States. And in some regards, they're actually winning that battle because that uncertainty is creating a pause on investment at the moment. But a deal is doable if there's some creativity on both sides.
Just explain to me a bit about this sunset clause, because I don't quite get it. If this were a private deal, already any signatory has the right to pull out on advance notice, okay? So it's not like you're written in stone forever anyway. What's the difference between saying I get the right to pull out on 6 months' notice as opposed to we have to renegotiate it every 5 years?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because you're right. Right now we have the ability to pull out after 6 months' notice. But if there's a forced requirement that at 5 years all three countries have to act or it automatically goes away, the view is that will change the dynamic. And you can imagine in our own politics, people running for president might be pressed to say, if I'm elected president, I will not renew NAFTA. And that's kind of uncertainty is what people are very concerned about. There are other issues, too, around autos, wanting to redo the supply chains and move more of that supply chain back to the United States and less spread over the three countries. Those are very technical and complicated negotiations. But again, I think there are ways of solving that problem.
Canada's Chrystia Freeland in Mexico City today saying just a few minutes ago that Canada strongly opposes a sunset clause, that Canada believes in NAFTA as a trilateral pact. She always expected moments of drama on NAFTA, not surprisingly. When it comes to the trilateral pact framework, we have heard President Trump now last week talk about potential separate deals and that he would prioritize Mexico. Could this sort of divide and conquer approach succeed?
It's possible, but it's hard to see because the North American market is now one integrated production platform. You've got companies where shipping products back over one border or the other 5 or 6 times before the product is ultimately produced. They want to know the certainty of what's the tariff treatment going to be of their inputs. And if that information is uncertain, it's very hard to see how they plan for the future.
It was interesting to see these talks accelerating recently because they stalled just ahead of the presidential election in Mexico. How important is it for the Mexicans to get a deal before you get a new government of López Obrador?
So there's a 6-month transition period between the governments in Mexico. And historically, the Mexican government has done quite a bit during those 6 months to clear out the deck and resolve issues. So I think there's an effort to try and get an agreement during this period of time. And the incoming administration is working very closely with the outgoing administration through this negotiation.
Michael, take us behind the scenes here a little bit because you've been there. What about the bandwidth issue? I mean, I don't remember at least a situation where we had major negotiations on trade doing with China, with Europe, with Canada, with Mexico. I mean, that's a lot. Do we have the bandwidth to really, as it were, walk and chew gum at the same time?
You know, Ambassador Lighthizer, who's the current USTR, is a very experienced trade expert. He's been in the field for more than 30 years. He's got a good team there at USTR negotiating these agreements. I think they do have the bandwidth, provided that there's a unified administration approach to these negotiations. I think one of the challenges is that we read that there's division within the administration and that there's as much negotiation going on internally as there might be externally. It's a lot easier when you're a negotiator sitting at the table with other countries if you know that there's a unified, supportive environment back home.
As you say, Ambassador Lighthizer has a lot of experience negotiating trade deals, but a lot of that was like in the 1980s with respect to cars from Japan and things like that. It's a different era now. Does the mindset of the administration really work in the 21st century when we've gone over much more to services? It's not about steel. It's not even about automobiles anymore. It's about intellectual property.
It's a very good point. I mean, this administration is very focused on the bilateral trade deficits that we have with certain countries and more focused at times on reducing imports than they are on opening markets to expand exports. Most of what they talk about is about the manufacturing trade deficit. Of course, we have a trade surplus in services. 80% of the American public is employed in the services sector. That doesn't seem to be as high on their agenda as trying to restore stronger manufacturing in the U.S. And of course, we are a strong manufacturing country. We're actually producing more manufactured product now than we ever have in our history. Unfortunately, it's with fewer workers as we become more productive or there's been more automation. And that's, I think, what's really driving this.
The U.S. continues to use the national security grounds reason to implement tariffs. Is this like opening the Pandora's box? Will other countries also use this tactic?
The United States has historically been very reluctant to use the national security exception precisely for that reason, that even though we might do it in a narrow way, other countries might use it just to keep as an excuse for protectionism. And that's why these actions that have been taken on steel and aluminum and the actions being contemplated on autos and auto parts are so significant, because it's really for the first time using them in that sort of way. The last time it was used was way back in the 80s, I believe, having to do with machine tools that were actually used to make munitions. It was a case to be made on that. A little harder to make the case that our auto sector is under threat and we need to protect it for our national security purposes.